For more on all of the latest news coming out of Yemen, I'm joined now from London by Iona Craig. She's an independent journalist and the Yemen correspondent for the Times of London. And thank you for being here.
Thank you.
The Paris Charlie Hebdo terrorists were trained by al-Qaida in Yemen. Why has Yemen become the training ground for these militant fighters, as you see it?
Well, really, the issue goes back to lawlessness and a lack of state control. Arguably, the Yemeni state has struggled to control the country ever since it existed, since the Republic of North Yemen was created in the late 60s. State control has never been complete. It's a very tribal society. And because of that lack of state control, there's large areas of the country that have always had a sense of lawlessness. And it's with that and that lack of security that organizations like al-Qaida are able to operate, are able to run these sort of training camps. And that security vacuum really peaked in 2011, but has become increasingly worse again in the last 6 months. So when the Charlie Hebdo attack happened, those two brothers that carried out that attack had come to Yemen in 2011, which was at the height of the security vacuum because of the political unrest of the Arab Spring. But really, that security vacuum has got worse again in the last 6 months.
Yeah, obviously, because in the last days we've seen Yemen's chief of staff kidnapped and ransomed. What role actually do you see Yemen's geography playing in the current crisis?
Well, obviously, the geography is important to Yemen. It's strategically important. It lies next to the Bab el-Mandab Strait, which is where huge amounts of the world oil is transported through up to the Suez Canal. But really, the example of this kidnapping that you mentioned just proves the lack of state control. The bin Mubarak, who was kidnapped, was taken by the Shia Houthi movement, who have effectively been in control in Sana'a, in the capital, since September, when they took control by force. Although they didn't kick the president out, they have been increasingly taking a stranglehold on the government, going into ministry buildings, seizing control, and taking measures to take control of even the government's finances. So although effectively Hadi is still there as president by name, the guys with the guns are the ones that are really in charge here.
And tell us how prominent the religious fundamentalism is in this area right here you're talking about.
Well, of course, AQAP was really created in Yemen in early 2009. It's an amalgamation of the Saudi Arabia al-Qaida groups and in Yemen. It was formerly formed as AQAP, al-Qaida in the Arabian Peninsula, in early 2009. But it was really that Saudi influence of the more conservative Sunni Wahhabi Islam that came over the border into Yemen, and a combination of that and the security vacuum that I already mentioned that really allowed them to operate and allowed them to take hold inside the country. Obviously, the response from the West has been mostly one about security and a military response. So we've seen drone strikes from America that have been carried out in Yemen for over 10 years now. But really, we can see now that that hasn't been the answer. It hasn't been the solution. It hasn't solved the problem of AQAP in Yemen. So you really have to ask the question of how else, what other measures can the international community take to resolve that problem? And really, you have this underlying problem of governance. You've got 25 million people in Yemen, most of whom who do not have access to fresh water, a lack of electricity, basic services. There's over 60% unemployment amongst the youth, and you've got a system of government that is deeply corrupt. That obviously requires a huge long-term commitment by the international community. But without that commitment, we know and we've seen that the military option has not worked.
Can we quickly ask you a question about ISIL and the battle between these two groups to become more predominant with al-Qaida and ISIL? We were talking to our previous guest about this. Do you see that al-Qaida could ever overthrow ISIL?
AQAP in Yemen at the moment, no. ISIL is a much more powerful group than them at the moment. AQAP has actually been at odds with ISIS, as we know that al-Qaida has as well within Syria. They don't recognize the Islamic State as a caliphate. They don't recognize Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as the caliph. But I think we have seen some more unity now as a result of what happened in Paris. that there was, these two brothers who seemed to pledge their allegiance to AQAP, whereas the other was attached to ISIS, and their common goal is attacking the West, and that brings them together. And certainly if there was a unification between the two groups, that would make them altogether much more dangerous than they already are.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Ms. Craig. We really appreciate your time and your insight and expertise on this subject, joining us live from London.